So. Sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel discussion about the important question, how many are we on the situation of the Russian opposition? Now, this is an event of the IG Börsenverein, promoted by the German Federal Foreign Office. So first of all, there's my long-standing friend Irina Scherbakova. Irina Scherbakova for decades has been part of Russian opposition. So if anybody asks themselves, how many are we? Who are we? The group of Memorial has always been part of it and is basically the founding organization of Russian opposition, as it were. So something very sad has happened, and something very nice, really, but it's very sad. Irina, all of you have been awarded the Peace Prize, Peace Nobel Prize of 2022. Everybody asked themselves, well, why only now? And I asked myself, do you have to almost fail in order to be getting this prize? So what did you ask yourself? Yes, the microphone is working. Thank you so much. Well, of course, it is incredible. It's an incredible appreciation of our work. We didn't expect to be awarded the Peace Prize, Peace Nobel Prize this year, and it's been incredibly important for also two other organizations to be awarded the same prize, because otherwise for Memorial in this current situation it wouldn't have been possible to be receiving and accepting this prize in the current situation. But the decision that Ales Bielaski, whom we've known for many, many years and who's been in prison for many, many years in Belarus. And then there's another fantastic organization from Ukraine under Alexandra Milyanitschuk, who's also been awarded the prize, and we've known them for many, many years as well. At least our human rights activists have got very close contacts with them. So in this composition of groups, it was possible to receive this prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. I know that the reaction in Ukraine has been difficult. Why? Well, because for many people it's been inconceivable to do anything together with Russians these days. But still, we believe that this award is not a reconciliation or anything, because it's not possible to even talk about reconciliation these days. It's only a sign that at the end of the day, those forces which are against the current regime in Russia are at least receiving some hope for the future. That's how I would like to put it. And for those living in Russia, I mean, Memorial was liquidated as a network, but there are still organizations that carry on working also abroad, also in Russia, under the very strong pressure which is being exerted on them. But it's very, very important for them. And certainly this will now increase the pressure on these organizations. It will not reduce them. Now, Mikhail Shishkin, for many, many years, has been part of the Russian opposition. He's one of the harshest critics of Vladimir Putin. And let me just quote what he said once. Mikhail Shishkin says, "It hurts to be Russian. Monstrous crimes are committed in the name of my people, of my country, in my name. You want to love your homeland and you want to be proud of it. But how can you love your mother when she eats your own and other people's children? Russia has been doing this for centuries and cannot stop. Today's Russia is a fascist state. This war represents a moral and humanitarian bankruptcy of Russian culture." This is what he said. Mikhail Shishkin, welcome. Were you full of rage when you wrote those lines? Well, rage, but also a lot of frustration, mainly. Desperation as well, for sure. Leonid Volkov also wrote something. I don't know how much rage or desperation you felt when you wrote your book. Here it is. Putinland is the title of this book. The imperial manism. Now you are part of the most recent opposition organization, at least in the group of 3 people talking to me here today. And you're also part of the most powerful organization, at least recently, working together with Alexei Navalny, this is. Now, if we remember 1 year ago, in February 2021, in 180 cities, there were protest demonstrations. This was about Alexei Navalny ending up in prison. 100,000 people were on the streets, even more than that. Then 1 year later, there's this bombardment after the invasion in Ukraine. For 9 months now, there has been a war. And in 180 cities, there's nobody going on the streets. Where are the demonstrators? Well, that is not true. There are cities, and more than 20,000 people have been arrested in those Russian cities because they went out and protested against the war. And there were very strong anti-war protests in the first weeks of the war. And there still are demonstrations these days in Russia against the war. And then if you consider the risks people are running if they go out on the streets, the risks have increased tremendously. You might end up in prison for 15 years. You have to expect this. Just if you go on the streets and if you call war, war, instead of calling it what Putin wants them to call it. And Putin, of course, tried to kill Navalny, to poison him. And Putin has also tried to destroy all of the political opposition movements, such as Memorial, the Navalny movement, and all of them. And now we understand why. He wanted to be sure that there weren't going to be any protests in the country once he was going to be attacking Ukraine. He didn't want there to be a fifth column, and he miscalculated things tremendously, though. All of his calculations went terribly wrong when he started this war. And there is resistance. Russians don't support this war. The population doesn't support this war. And so we should also say this. Now, is the perception that we have here completely false? When we report about Russia, when we can hardly report from out of Russia because it's hardly possible for foreign correspondents to be reporting from within Russia, but with the help of our producers, we try to report from out of Russia, and then there is not a lot to report about any mass protests. Well, because it's not possible to organize any mass protests. They're too dangerous. But something that is possible, Mikhail Shishkin and Irina, let me also involve you in this discussion. Something we saw was the following. When this partial mobilization was announced in September, all of a sudden, then Russian men left the country. All of a sudden, they can move, they leave the country, they go abroad. All of a sudden, they go out on the streets. So what's going on? Irina, would you mind explaining this to us? Well, first of all, let me say the following. What I define opposition is, of course, political forces, like Navalny, staff, etc. And Memorial was part of the critical civic society. Of course, everything is politics, as we can see, and history has become part of politics. But we have never supported any political party. And in that sense, we are representing culture, proper opposition, and the civic society. That's whom we represent here, the three of us. And my point of view is the following. It's developed gradually and slowly. So it has taken time to slide into this dictatorship. It was a slow process where we were taking away liberties and freedoms. And this has really destroyed people. And there have been protests, but at the end of the day, this corroded people and disintegrated the movements because it's taken such a long time to take away all of these liberties and these freedoms. And you really have to experience living in a dictatorship or just see Belarus, where 80% of people went on the streets. But if there's people with weapons, and if you're willing to torture those that you put into prison, and they would even be willing to shoot at people, if they took to the streets. And those Russian demonstrations were rather diffuse. First of all, you need structures to organize proper opposition, and those were destroyed. The people from the Navalny staff either had to leave the country or have ended up in prison. So they've been banned and destroyed. Many people are in prison. And then once the war started on the 24th of February, they left the country. So it's led to an atomization of Russian society, because when people fled the country after this mobilization, it was an individual decision of those hundreds of thousands of people, because there wasn't any movement behind that. Those were individual decisions of those men. And of course, it's fair to ask yourself why those 700,000 didn't take to the streets. Why did they leave the country when the partial mobilization was announced in September? Well, because people got used to dictatorship after this gradual process, and then when he declared partial mobilization, people said, okay, let me save my skin and leave the country and flee. But each and every soldier less available for this war is better than not being there to fight, than being there to fight. What about you, Mikhail Shishkin? Would you have expected more Russians to be protesting against this war? Or, well, just like everybody else, I hoped that they were going to protest, but I didn't expect it, to be quite honest. Do you know what? In '68, those 7 protests on the Red Square, we knew that they were lost. They basically offered their life to human dignity because they knew that the Russian tanks were entering the Czechoslovakia. And the Czechs said, well, those 7 people on the Red Square, they are there for us, and each and everyone who protests against the war and each and everyone who takes to the streets or who's in prison is yet another reason not to hate Russians. Now, I mean, that's the only hope we can have. It's a tiny hope because it really hurts to see how these thousands and thousands of men, after the partial mobilization, like sheep, are now going to die in this war themselves. And they're leaving their wives behind, their mothers. And these mothers and these wives don't even go to demonstrate either. Do you know what? These people work differently. And you're expecting an explanation from us what's going on in their heads. They are simply different. For generations, they have been different. The generation of Russians were abused by power, and they don't know where there's the difference between a homeland and a dictatorship. There's always those at the top, just like the sky, and these who've got the power have to be obeyed, and we're here to defend our homeland, you know. So don't even ask yourselves, or they're not asking themselves why they're being called to fight in Ukraine now, because they're having to defend their homeland from the fascists, allegedly. And the last hope I had is once the coffins return, that then the mothers and the wives would say, well, Putin killed my son or my husband. And what are we seeing now? They're saying, oh, the Ukrainians have killed my son or my husband. So what can we do with these people? How can we change these people? May I add the following? Well, Irina said it correctly. We are the political opposition, whilst Memorial is a human rights organization. And then Mikhail is the cultural opposition. Of course, we've got different positions, so to speak, but for politicians, it's quite clear that there is hope. We just have to carry on working, and we have to continue with our work. Leonid, let me just ask you the following, because in your book you said that Putin in Russia has set up a fascist dictatorship and the world has accepted, has let it go by. I'd like to talk to you about this. Why has the world accepted it? Why didn't Russia accept it? Why didn't the Russian citizens prevent this fascist dictatorship to be established by Putin? Well, this is exactly why I wrote the book. So you're blaming the world, but you're not blaming your own people. That's my understanding. Yes, that's true, because the Russian people is a victim of Putin, and the world is to blame that Russia has turned fascist. Well, Putin basically tortured the Russian people for 20 years. For 20 years, Putin has taken away incredible sums of money, hiding them in the Western countries. And during all of these countries, the West basically did business as usual with Putin. Even after 2007, the speech in Munich, in 2008, when he attacked Georgia, and when he took Crimea. And this terminated basically the world order after Potsdam, because that was the first change of borders in Europe after 1945. And they always bought gas and oil and acknowledged Putin as a legitimate president and did business with him, you know. Okay, let's maybe hear the opinion of the other two speakers. Irina, what do you think if somebody says that the world has let it happen for Russia to become a fascist dictatorship? Well, I'm a historian. Therefore, my view, of course, is always looking from the past to the present. I believe it's not that easy, because in the 90s we had very turbulent years. But I saw this, how, for example, there were various people who were responsible. As always, it's enshrined also in Russian society as to why Russians, for example, at the end of the 90s, didn't even appreciate democracy or democratic institutions or all of these freedoms or liberties. They didn't appreciate them. So they thought, oh, the 90s are so chaotic. What has this democracy led to? There's nothing positive. And when then Putin, came out of this Pandora's box, they thought, okay, things are better now. And Putin straight away said, okay, don't you dare interfere. Don't you dare interfere. There weren't even any free trade unions anymore that were created in the 90s to protect even workers' rights. And people were happy. They accepted it. And then step by step, he took away more and more liberties and freedoms. And we heard this so many times. Being a historian, we warned people. We said, look back into what happened in history. Check what sort of values they're talking about. And this can only go in the wrong direction. We did warn people. So this seeming stability, talking about, the rules of gold, of oil and gas. So it was the state making the Russians believe that they were going to sort everything out and create welfare for citizens. So in 2008 and then in 2012, we had the first protests, the real first protests, because people saw this. They saw that the state didn't even comply with what they promised, and it became worse and worse and worse. And nothing came of that deal. But the opportunities that people had weren't used, So, and now people are where they are. They don't have any rights whatsoever, and they are in the midst of a war with this mobilization, and they don't have any protection at all, because everything's been destroyed. The human rights that they didn't appreciate have been taken away from them. Let me just add the following two comments regarding this. Yes, it has even leveled the street for Putin and made it possible for him to be even more successful. 2007, we had Georgia. 2014, we had Crimea, the Minsk Accord, the Minsk Agreement. And of course, he started the war fully convinced that the West was going to accept it. Also because of this business as usual, because of the economic interests that had really existed for many, many years. And of course, he didn't expect at all. He thought, okay, Ukraine will be destroyed quickly and the West will have to accept it because they want to buy oil and gas from us. And he did use oil and gas to blackmail the West. So in that sense, certainly, there is a certain responsibility of the West, but to blame the West for this development that Russia is now a fascist dictatorship is something I don't agree with. Okay, so the two of you would have to talk about this after the meeting, Irina and Leonid Volkov. Mikhail, what about you? Leonid says the West has to be blamed for Russia having turned fascist. Would you agree? Well, what Leonid said reminded me of 1945, when the Germans said, well, it turned out that Hitler was a psychopath, was a war criminal who was sick, but the German people, we didn't know anything. We are just victims of the Nazi regime. And I'm sure that we will be hearing the same in Russia. Yes, it turned out that Putin was only, a mentally ill war criminal, but we didn't know anything about it. We thought it was a special operation to free our brothers from the fascist Ukrainians. We're only victims of the Putin regime. That's what they'll say. And this will be the first step towards the new Putin. I'm absolutely sure that Putin will go, but there will be a new Putin. And the war in Europe didn't end with Hitler's death, did it? But it ended with the total destruction of the Nazi state, of this entire machinery. So the possible start of a new Russia will only be possible under one proviso, the recognition of national guilt. Just like at the time when Willy Brandt, went on his knees in Warsaw and recognized, this has to happen in Kiev, in Irpin, in Mariupol, in all of those towns or in countries, even in Prague, in Budapest, in Vilnius. That's where this recognition of guilt has to happen. Otherwise, it's not possible. But this recognition of guilt in Germany was possible only thanks to the Allied forces. Neither NATO nor Ukrainians can destroy this Russian state. That's not possible. So where does this our zero start? Russia can only be fought and won over by the Russians themselves, that's for sure. That's why we'll have to wait and see what will happen once Putin will be dead. But whether my compatriots will really use the opportunity and find the strength to start a new democratic state remains to be seen, is a very big question. Leonid, do you see this possibility for the Russian people to really acknowledge that guilt, to recognize their guilt, vice versa, Ukraine, and to also do reparation after that as a second step? I totally agree with everything that you've just said. And when I said that some of the guilt, or that the West is to be blamed in part, that doesn't mean that the Russians aren't to blame at the same time. Unfortunately, there have been many stakeholders that have contributed to what's happening right now, and that it came so far. And if we already compare this with 1945, well, Hitler was possible because of what happened after the First World War. After the First World War, there was the opinion that things had been unfair with the Munich Agreement. So that's how the political capital started. And that's how they then tried to prevent that this was going to happen again. That's why denazification happened and the Marshall Plan then started and was agreed upon. Now, the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, and there was no Marshall Plan after that. So that was used by Putin to create his political capital. So the 1990s were very difficult years for most Russians, and many people also thought that they had been treated unfairly. And as a result, Putin used this as a means for his own propaganda. And that's how he then created everything around him. And then in 1991, they said the West was unfair, and that's why we now have to rebuild the Soviet empire. Now, we need both components for the future of Russia. Firstly, the de-Putinization, so the recognition of guilt. And yes, I totally agree. The first visit, international visit with the next Russian president should be to Bucha. Otherwise, you can't start with recognition of guilt. But the international community also has to learn from this, and there should be a Marshall Plan for reconstruction. And these things together can then achieve a better and a new Russian democratic state. Let me repeat the question. Do you have the impression that Russians, your compatriots, would be willing to acknowledge guilt vis-à-vis Ukrainians or Ukraine? Yes, I believe that. That will be possible. Do you really see that Russians are suffering and that they are contrite and that they are suffering from their own people killing Ukrainians? Well, not yet, but a lot is changing in Russian society, and a lot will continue to change. Unfortunately, also with high military losses and many, many Russian victims as well as a result of this war. It will still take time. That's all very, very sad indeed. But of course it will happen. And there is no other way around this. Are you that sure as well, Irina, that your compatriots will be capable of acknowledging guilt? Well, I'm a historian. On the other hand, I'm also a pragmatic person. And I believe that the first step, in the long term, we're looking too far ahead into the future, I believe. So the first step that should happen now is that Ukraine must win this war. And everything that needs to be done in order to make Ukraine win must be done. If Ukraine doesn't win the war, nothing will change in Russia. We all agree that far. However, what will happen after that, we have to prepare for that, and you have to prepare what will be the long-term future. So this needs to be a very intensive but structured process, organized by the international community, together with the internal forces, together with various commissions and committees, etc., to make sure that guilt will be acknowledged and recognized. Because, as a matter of fact, at the end of the day, those who've committed the crimes tend to say, well, everybody was a perpetrator. For example, Hitler was to blame, Stalin was to blame, just this one person. But what this means is that this guilt, at the end of the day, is then something that doesn't affect you. If you say everybody was to blame, then you don't like it. No, these guilt, those crimes must be mentioned, and the perpetrators of these crimes must be punished. And that never happened. This has never happened so far. This is a very, very dangerous trend that we've seen, and many people have pointed this out, and we've now seen the consequences of how far things have gone. And this is the only chance for Russia to be really going towards democracy and freedom one day in the long run. But I'm equally convinced that it will be a very, very long, tedious and painful journey. And the price will not be the same that we had at the end of the 80s. The price that will have to be paid for what's happening now, it cannot be compared with the end of the 80s. The price that Russia will have to pay might be huge. Nothing will be the same as it ever was for Russia. Not even its borders will stay the same as they were. Do your compatriots now know that Russia is a pariah state? Well, of course, people know this. This is also being said. Are you being ironic? Well, now we have to redefine all of the words. What are Russians? What is Russia? What is Russian culture? You have to redefine everything from scratch. In the 19th century, the most important questions in Russia were the questions as to who's to blame. What are we supposed to do? But these were questions for the readers and the 150 million illiterate farmers. They had other important questions, and the most important question for Russia was: is the Tsar right, or is the Tsar false, or is he right? And you can only decide that based on a military victory. If you've got a military victory, it doesn't make any difference how many millions the Tsar killed. In that case, the Tsar was true, and therefore, so far, Putin's been true. And those who lost, such as Gorbachev, for example, who lost the war in Afghanistan and the Cold War against the West. I mean, these people are being despised. And Putin is the only legitimate representative of Russia, and by the annexation of Crimea, Russia has declared himself as legitimate, and now he's already lost his legitimacy. If you read the patriotic telegram channels, they're writing, oh, the Tsar is false, we're looking for a new Tsar. And once the new Tsar will be around, then he will be able to prove his legitimacy only through another war. There's no other possibility. The Russian Federation is now already flirting with other states, as was the case with the Soviet Union. And, the Russian Federation is falling apart, and just as it's happened before. And whether in these new states, also with the most free elections, opposition leaders, foreign agents will be elected, or whether the true patriots will be elected, let's wait and see what will happen and who will be elected. It's not all looking that good, I don't think. So we need a Nuremberg process. At the time, in the 90s, we missed that chance. The destabilization, Nuremberg processes against the Communist Party would have been necessary. So as a result, the new dictatorship was created. It was only a matter of time. A dictatorship needs enemies and war, and now we're in the midst of this dictatorship. So who is going to be enacting the Nuremberg process? Certainly not those who have perpetrated the war crimes themselves. They won't organize a Nuremberg process. Leonid, you have announced that with those living abroad, you will be creating an underground organization that will prepare the hour zero once Putin will be gone. Now, everything we've just heard now, like the process against the perpetrators of crimes during the war, talking about individual guilt, reparation vis-à-vis Ukraine, recognition guilt vis-à-vis Ukraine, is that also part of your political program? Or do you only consider right now that you want to take over power? Is it just a very streamlined version of targets? Well, this is part of our political program, but this will be the second stage, of course. The first step is not to take power. The first step is to end the war. It's not assumption of power or coming to power. We want Ukraine to win the war. That's the most important objective, even for Russia. So how can you achieve that? A war in the 21st century is not just a militarily defined war. A war happens at various levels. So you've got the military level on the military front, but then there's also the economic level with sanctions, etc. And of course, what's also very important is what's happening in the information era. And that's where we have been very active. On the 24th of February 2022, we had the broadest and best information channels with millions of people in Russia. This thanks to the decades of our work before, where we created those information channels. And that was also our responsibility, to make sure that those media channels were supposed to be used in order to tell the truth, and to make sure that as many people as possible would understand what's actually happening in Russia. Now, after the 21st of September, the mobilization, a lot has changed. Unfortunately, and let's also acknowledge this, the 24th of February didn't change all that much in Russia than the 21st of September, the partial mobilization. Now, with the partial mobilization, Putin destroyed his social contract, as Irina already said. So this deal where you as citizens don't ask any questions about Russian politics, and I'm, being the president, guarantee that you'll be okay in your well-being in Russia. That's been destroyed now. So finally, we've got this dormant majority that's now woken up a little bit, and they're now asking questions. They are asking, well, why is my father, brother, son being asked to go to war. Why is there this mobilization? Why is he supposed to be dying there? What are we doing in Ukraine anyway? It's too late, but at least people are now asking these questions. And being a political organization, we have to do our utmost to answer those questions. That's why we've got a very strong regional structure, where we're trying to talk to people locally. I've got a question to Leonid. To me, it's quite clear. The opposition can achieve something if the opposition is united and not fragmented and not controversial in its targets. But there are various centers of opposition in London, in Piotrkovsk, the Forum, Free Russia of Garry Kasparov, the Congress of Deputies of Ilya Ben-Mariamov in Kiev, etc. So there's various organizations. So the question is the following. Why are they quarreling? And why are you not accepting invitations from other opposition parties and opposition groups? Now, that is such a big question. That is a good question for next round of discussions, because we've only got 1 hour here. We've got to close. We've used it. And that hour is up now, unfortunately. It is up because people have told us that we've got to leave, unfortunately. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. I do hope that we'll meet again, and then we might hear an answer to that question as to how many we are. How many are we on the situation of the Russian opposition? Because we can't tell how many are part of the Russian opposition. Thank you very much for your interest, and thank you very much to the speakers.